just to introduce the session and the series and today's speakers. First of all, my name is Jing Liu. I'm the Executive Director of the Michigan Institute for Data Science at the University of Michigan. So this Generative AI Coast-to-Coast series is something that we set up fairly quickly this summer because of all the enthusiasm among researchers around the use of generative AI in research. So the goal really is to show the research community what some of the pioneers in this area are working on as examples for everyone to stimulate new ideas and to also build collaboration while we're all exploring this new space together. This series has 4 webinars. In each webinar, there will be 2 speakers from 2 universities on talking about an overlapping theme. We'll have a 30-minute audience Q&A time. While the presentations are happening, audience members are welcome to submit questions in the Q&A. We also have received a number of questions through the registration form. First of all, though, I do want to give credit to the image that you're seeing here. As you know, lots of AI tools now are very handy in generating images. So this is the prompt I gave in Midjourney. Scientists from the East Coast to the West Coast are using generative AI to conduct scientific research. And so this is the image that I got. And just to show you how much this kind of image generation, or in general, the use of generative AI is dependent on the prompt. This is my next prompt. Same thing, but I asked Midjourney to give me a picture in My Neighbor Totoro style. And so this is what I got. And so I want to mention that this series is a collaboration of 6 institutes, of data science and AI institutes at 6 universities. I also want to mention that the people who put in the effort to actually organize this whole series. So Leah Shanley at the International Computer Science Institute, Kathy Smith at the Ohio State University, Sarah Stone at University of Washington, Rachel Sutton and Beth Uberseeder, both at University of Michigan, Ani Thakar at Johns Hopkins, and Angela Wilkins at Rice University. So, so this is the first webinar that happened a couple of weeks ago. I will introduce speakers of today's webinar in a second. I also want to mention that next week we have 2 webinars coming up. One is a conversation on policy, ethics, and generative AI. Another is a look under the hood. That's the sort of the technical principles of generative AI. So I hope to see you next week as well. So today we have 2 speakers. Shia Ning is Professor of Biomedical Informatics and Computer Science and Engineering at The Ohio State University. Her research is on AI data mining, machine learning, and big data analytics, with applications mainly in drug discovery, medical informatics, and health informatics. So the research in the lab is highly data-driven, computation-oriented, and primarily focused on methodology development. Then after Shia, we'll have Arlei Silva, who is Assistant Professor of Computer Science at Rice University. His research focuses on developing algorithms and models for mining and learning from complex data sets, broadly defined as data science, especially data graph and network data. His work is particularly motivated by computational social science, healthcare, and infrastructure research. So before I ask Shia to start her presentation, I also want to mention for the audience members, please put questions in Q&A anytime. So our experience from the first webinar is that there were a huge number of questions. And in order to get through a lot of them, I will be asking the questions instead of unmuting audience members for them to join the conversation. If we have fewer questions today, we might be able to do that, but probably not. We will, at the end of the, after this webinar, we will collect all the questions and answers, and we'll email them all to the audience members. Okay, so with that, I'm going to ask Shia to take over from here.
Thank you. Let's see. Can you see my screen? Okay. I hope you can see my screen, right?
Yes, it looks good.
Thank you, Jing. So thank you. And I'm Xia. I'm a professor from the Biomedical Informatics and Computer Science at OSU, and I'm a core faculty in the Translational Data Analytics Institute, TDAI, at OSU. I'm very happy to be here to share our research and ideas with you on generative AI for drug discovery. So when we talk about generative AI, I mean, I think you've heard a lot about generative AI, but somehow by default, when we talk about generative AI, people mean ChatGPT or large language models, and we generate texts, images, or audios. But I really want to mention that actually generative AI for science has been really developed in the last few years. For example, we have AlphaFold to generate the folding structures of proteins, and there have been a lot of work on small molecule generation for drug candidates or for drug design, and also peptide generation for anti-cancer vaccines and RNA sequence generation also for vaccines. There has been a lot of work on Gen AI for science. And actually, there has been a very interesting trend on generative AI for science over the past few years. And generative AI has been on the top of the AI index report every year. So if we look at the report from 2021, the focus of research on generative AI was on generating text, audios, and images. In 2022, clearly it is about large language models and also all the concerns about large language models. And this year, very interestingly, the fourth takeaway on the AI index report is on generative AI for science. And for example, generate new antibodies. So hopefully you can see a clear trend here about generative AI towards science, and we want to use generative AI to really improve scientific research. With that, I want to give you three concrete pieces of research that have been done in my lab. And within each work, I will also talk about the challenges and opportunities. And if time allows, I will briefly talk about the last one on peptide generation. So given that the first work we have been done is on small molecule optimization or small molecule generation. So small molecule optimization actually is a very important phase or a step in drug discovery. So if you can see this figure here, this is a very high-level summary of drug discovery, which starts from target identification and then large-scale screening to identify promising drug candidate. And then after that, with those ligands or molecules which show promising properties, people want to optimize their structures so as to improve their properties or to change their properties. For example, selectivity, toxicity, hydrophobicity, those properties. So the idea here is the properties of small molecules are associated with their structures. So by changing the structures, for example, if we can change this aromatic ring into a different structure, then we can change their properties. So this has been done more or less manually by chemists, and as you can tell from the previous figure, the successful rate is not that high. So our idea is to accelerate this process using generative AI. Now the question becomes, given a molecule, how to change or how to modify the structure of this molecule so as to improve the property. So as you may see, there can be a lot of computational issues here. For example, how to represent small molecule structures. In our case, this is molecular graph structures, 2D structures, small graphs, and how to learn from graphs and how to generate from the learned knowledge or learned quote-unquote embeddings of small molecules. So these are all the very important and also very interesting problems for research. So here we developed something called MODIF, one fragment generative algorithm for molecule optimization. Just to give you a very high level idea of this method, this is a overall, this is a method based on variational autoencoder, and that has been a very widely used technique in small molecule generation or graph generation. So we have an encoder and a decoder, and we have a latent space here. So in the encoder, we really want to learn what structure, the difference of structures that is related to the difference of their properties. For example, if you look at these two small molecule structures, they are very similar except at a particular atom here. In the first small molecule, this atom, I believe, is a carbon is connected to a nitrogen, and in the second one, the carbon is connected to another ring. So the properties for these two molecules are different, and we think the difference is due to these different structures. So the idea we have is to learn the difference of these structures and encode the structures in the latent space. And in the decoding phase, we want to use knowledge or the encoding here to change a given molecule. So in the encoding part, we need to represent the molecules so that we can represent the structure difference. And in this case, we represent everything as 2D graphs, and we use graph neural networks, graph message passing method to aggregate information of each atom and to generate an embedding of each atom. And also, there is another different representation of small molecules called junction tree, which can get rid of all the rings. And also we represent the structures of all the atoms or all the nodes in the junction tree. So from there, we have representations of the small molecules, and the difference of those representations can be considered as the difference of their structures, and we represent the difference of the structures in the latent space. Following the variational autoencoder idea, it's going to be some Gaussian distribution. And the difference here, or the unique thing here, is in our latent space, we have two parts or two subspaces. The first half represents quote unquote what we need to remove from this molecule if we want to change the molecule. And the second half encodes what we need to add to the molecule if we want to improve the properties. So you can consider the embedding space, latent space represents such learned knowledge. In the decoding phase, given a molecule, actually we have two steps here. The first is we want to predict what we need to remove from this molecule. And second step is to predict, after we remove some fragments from the structure, what we need to add, what atoms or what bond we need to add in order to change the molecule to another one. And in order to decide what we need to remove, we use the first half of the latent space. So we just sample something, sample latent embedding from the first half of the latent space, and use that representation to predict where we need to remove and which atom we need to remove. And after we remove those atoms, in the second step, we sample another latent representation from the second half of the latent space, and we use that to predict step by step at which atom we need to add something new, and what atom we should add from there, and when we should stop. And from there, step by step, we can construct a new molecule. So this is a very high level idea of our graph generation or MALDIV idea. So overall, this is a very widely used variational autoencoder approach. And actually, this approach has been very widely used in a lot of molecule generation methods. So I want to briefly mention some results here, but before that, I want to give you a quick idea about the existing method in the literature and in terms of their technologies. So there has been a lot of work developed for small molecule generation, and in terms of technologies, variational autoencoder JTVE here is a very widely used method. The key idea there is to embed small molecules into latent space and sample from the latent space and decode from there. And another type of method is reinforcement learning. For example, here, GCPN is a graph convolution policy network. So the idea is to add atoms one by one until you are done. And of course, there is a reward function to measure the properties of the final product. And another type of method is flow-based. So the idea here is to learn a invertible mapping between molecule structures and a simple distribution, for example, Gaussian. And that mapping can be inversed. So you sample something from the Gaussian distribution and you go back to the original structure. So that's another type of method. And our method is based on variational autoencoder, but different from others in the sense that we learn the differences of molecules. So as a one-sentence summary of our properties, we can do a better job compared to the existing method in terms of property improvement. Here it's P log P measures the hydrophobicity and also the synthesizability of small molecules, and we can provide very similar molecules. And also the similar molecules to the known molecules. So just to give you a quick example about how our method change different structures. So we start from this structure and we want to change this molecule. First, we just cut a small fraction here and add another ring here that will improve the performance, the properties significantly. And then we add another fragment here and a small fragment here. Those red ones are the new fragments that we added. And you can tell we can add those different fragments or different atoms at different locations of a small molecule. Just a quick idea here. So we have this paper available, and from this study, actually, we identify several issues in this research topic, probably not very specific to the research topic, but at least we observe that here. For example, how people compare different methods on the benchmark data set, like probably this is common in many research topics that people don't, it's not really a fair comparison. People report results on different test data sets and compare the results across them. And also there is an issue about environmental overfitting, or in other words, whether we are truly exploring new spaces of or new subspaces of small molecules, or we are just optimizing within our known molecules. So I think these are these are some very interesting topics that will need further research. And as you can tell, this work is on 2D small molecule graphs, and actually molecules function in 3D space by binding to the pocket of ligands, a pocket of targets. Actually, this is a very important idea for ligand-based drug discovery, drug design. So the idea is after the high throughput screening, we know which molecules can bind to the targets, and we want to design better molecules based on those molecules called ligands. And we want to design the 3D structures for those new molecules. So we developed this shape model method using a diffusion framework. So the idea here is first we learn how to embed 3D shapes, and we use the 3D shapes as a condition in the diffusion framework. So to embed the 3D shapes, I mean, we generate the molecule surfaces and then sample some sample point cloud from the surface mesh and embed the point cloud into a latent space. This embedding is done through again, autoencoder framework. And the key thing here is to ensure that the embedding is going to be equivariant. That is, if the molecule is rotated, for example, the embedding of the rotated 3D shapes should be the same as you rotate the embedding before the rotation. And after we learn the embeddings, again, this is a diffusion framework. So in the forward process, we just add noises to the coordinates of these 3D molecules and also add noises to the atom types until everything becomes a Gaussian distribution for coordinates and categorical distribution for the atom types. And in the backward phase, we denoise step by step in order to generate a small molecule. When we do the denoising diffusion process, we use the shape embedding as our condition. And by the denoising, we can generate a 3D structure. So that's a very high level idea. And here, just a quick example of the 3D structures we generated. This is a molecule, or you can consider this is a non-ligand structure. And we want to generate ligands that are similar to this ligand in terms of their 3D shapes. And the shades here represent the 3D structures. And the second figure here in each panel represents a superimposition of the shapes. And you can tell we can generate more similar 3D structures, but not very similar 2D structures compared to the given molecule. That means, this is actually a desired property that in desired property ligand-based drug discovery, we want diverse in terms of 2D graphs and very similar shapes in 3Ds. But unfortunately, when we generate those small molecules, they do not really exist in nature. So the next question is, how can we really make these molecules? So that motivates our next work on retrosynthesis prediction. Retrosynthesis is a procedure where, given a molecule, we want to identify the reactant that can be used to synthesize this molecule. So this is the reverse step or reverse phase of forward synthesis. Again, a very fancy figure or a very busy figure here. So we developed this G2 retro method to generate the reactants of any given molecule. And this method has two phases. The first one is to decide the reaction center, or in the given product, given molecule, where to break this molecule into two pieces. And each piece is called a thin film. And the second phase here is to complete thin film back into valid reactant, valid molecules. As you can imagine, there are a lot of representation things in order to predict where to break this molecule. We need to represent each atom in this molecule or each node in a molecular graph using message passing or neural networks, and then predict the reaction center and break from there. And in the second phase, again, we utilize the same idea as in MODIF, that is, we add atoms step by step, and in each step we need to decide where to add the atom and what atom types to add until we can complete these two pieces into valid reactant. Again, a lot of numbers, but for some ideas about the existing method in the literature. So there has been a lot method developed for retrosynthesis prediction, but they can categorized into three types. Template-based, meaning that there has been a lot of knowledge about synthesis, and people categorize them into different templates. And when we do the retrosynthesis, we can just identify the most suitable templates and put the templates together. And the template-free method, meaning that we don't really utilize any templates, and we just start from the product and come up with the reactants. Probably as the names suggest here, many of them are based on transformer methods. This is because the molecules can be represented as a smile string. A smile string is nothing but a sequence representation of the 2D topologies. If you do a graph traversal, that will give you a sequence representation. And people can apply transformer or NLP-based method to convert the sequence of the product back into the sequences of the reactants. So a lot of transformer-based method. Semi-template-based method, actually, our method is one of these methods. The idea there is to predict reaction centers and then complete the synthons. So this is probably the most interpretable one because this is what's happening in the reaction, and that can give the users some ideas about how we generate different reactants. So overall, I mean, we can achieve a much better performance, particularly if the reaction types are not known to us. Just to give you an example here, so this is a mitapivat. This is a new. This is a drug that was approved in 2021. So for this drug, the second figure shows quote unquote the ground truth. Actually, this is the reactions that are mentioned in their patent. And our method can accurately identify this reaction. This is our top one prediction. But at the same time, our method can also identify other possible reactions for this same drug. And our collaborator, who is a chemist, he said these three different reactions are also theoretically feasible to make this molecule. I think this is the point of some generative models. That is, they can generate or they can produce something that people don't probably never thought about, or they can generate some novel things such that they provide new options and new directions for these scientific problems. And another example here, I mean, so we want to produce this product, and our method can predict different reaction centers. The ground truth here is the reaction that has been patented, and in our case, we can accurately predict that in our top 5th prediction. However, among other top predictions, for example, in our top 1 predictions, this prediction probably is even is potentially viable and probably even higher in yielding. So it's still theoretically possible, and probably our collaborators said probably this is even better than the even better than the ground truth. And we also find other possible reaction centers, and based on the knowledge from our collaborator, they are also possible. So that, again, the papers are available online. And what is really interesting is about our peer review file. So it's a super long peer review file, and we received some very interesting review comments. For example, one of the reviewers said generative approach does not bring new data because, I mean, we don't have experimental validation of the experiments of the predicted of the generated reactions, and somehow they think we should evaluate all the more than 50,000 generated reactions. And also somehow we sense that they have concerns like whether our method can do a better job than human being, and what happened. We have to approve that it can be better than probably some people, some individuals can do. So I think these are very interesting perspectives that we received, and that also brings to some challenges that I've seen in this research area. So probably I will just skip this part and talk about the challenges here, or also the opportunities here. So I see the generative AI for science is really an interdisciplinary research, and we do need domain knowledge from different disciplines. For example, in our case, chemistry, and also and also when we generate new things for example, for drug discovery, there is an issue about trustworthy, whether the domain experts trust our methods or trust the results that we predicted. So we need to think about how to provide some interpretation or explanation about our methods and how we can do that. I think that's a very interesting question here. And evaluation and validation, I feel this is a very important thing, but probably is under addressed as for now. So when we generate something, if we compare what we generated with the ground truth, I think that does not make a total sense, because the whole point of generation is to generate something that is new. So how to evaluate computationally, what kind of metrics we should use to evaluate the generated reactions, generated molecules, that is something that at least not very clear to me, and I believe will need more research. And validation, particularly experimental validation from the wet lab, that's highly needed. But the question here is how to prioritize which generated entities that we should validate. So in our case, for example, we have more than 50K generated molecules. Which molecule reactions and which reactions to validate first in the wet lab, that's something that I think we still need a lot of research. And in the end, the whole goal of this generative AI for science is to translate what we generate into real practice, or in clinical settings, or hopefully out of the through the clinical trials and into clinical practice. I think that's still a long way to go. As you may tell, what we have been doing here is for the very early phase of drug discovery, and after that, it's going to be a lot of other things, and this really requires a lot of efforts from different expertise and from different domains. I think to make real impact in the end for the generative AI translation is going to be a key thing here. And I really hope we can focus, or the community can focus more on the translation for the generative AI. So given that, I feel that concludes my talk at this point, and just some acknowledgements to my funding agents and the students who are heavily involved in this piece of work. And I think that's about my presentation, and I welcome all the questions from the audience.
Thanks so much, Xia. Let's answer two specific questions that are in Q&A, and then move on to Arlei. So the two questions, the first one, can you see those questions?
Yes.
Yeah,
So the first question from Brandon, when moving back from the latent space into suggested modifications, how often is the suggested modification synthetically inaccessible? In a similar vein, that's a good question. In optimization of MALDI, were there any issues weeding out chemically impossible suggestions from possible suggestions? That's a very good question. So for the latent space. So let me share. For the latent space here, so when we build the latent space here, actually, we considered synthesizability a little bit, but not very explicitly, and also we don't really consider the synthesis accessibility, or how to synthesize the molecules in the end into the latent space. So I think that's a very good idea, and one of our current ideas is to generate molecules that is synthesizable. So by the during the process of the generation, we want to make sure explicitly that the molecule is synthesizable, and even we can provide the synthesis path for the molecule. But in this piece of work, my answer could be no. We didn't explicitly consider whether the modification can be synthetically accessible or not. Issues reading a chemical impossible, and whether this is chemical impossible suggestions or not, I would say not explicitly, but our encoder is learned from the data. So we believe all these things, whether it's chemically possible or not, these things have been encoded in the data. So it's fully data driven. So we believe and we really hope that the latent space really learn those chemical possible suggestions. But in terms of hard constraints, we didn't really put constraints there. I hope that answered the question. And next question, what kind of data were used to train this system, simulation-based or mixed with the lab measurements? So that's the question from Dragon. So we used USPTO patents. So over the years, people patent different reactions, different molecules, and the data, the patent molecule structures and reactions are publicly available, and we use those data set, and those data to train all the systems. And I think I agree with you. So the data is going to be very important, and also the data. I mean, when we train the data, it has to be validated from the labs. So that's the question to Dragon. And next question is from Josh. How far away do you believe we are from leveraging accurate synthesized drugs against the DHTs accelerating clinical trials? I think that's the goal in the end. I would say from my end, I still see a long way there. So first, the first hurdle we have is about the validation of all the molecules or all the reactions in the wet lab, and prioritize them, validate them, and select. I mean, only after the validation there, we can select the things from the we can move forward to the clinical trials. So I see probably it's a long way, but actually we see some successful stories from, for example, MIT. So that means it's very promising, but it's just there are different hurdles to go over. Okay, so I think these are the questions from the Q&A.
Yeah. All right. So thank you so much. I'm going to ask you to stop sharing and then let Arlei get started.
Thank you.
Looks good. Arlei, you're muted.
Awesome. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, thanks for letting me know. So my name is Arlei. I'm an assistant professor of computer science at Rice University. And I'm really excited to be here to both like talk a little bit about some work I have done on generative models for graphs, and also to learn about like what other people are doing and what questions you have. Yeah, so I would not claim that I'm an expert on generative models, but I'm really excited about the potential applications. And I have done some work on it, so I'm going to share some of my experience and also a little bit of a sort of historical view of like where I think these things are coming from and where I think they are going. So all the work that I'm going to be describing here is done in collaboration with Devolina Hauder, who is a PhD student at Rice University, Furkan Kokayuzufoglu, who is from UC Santa Barbara, PhD student, and Ambush Singh from UC Santa Barbara. Yes, and this is just the outline for the talk. So first I'm going to try to motivate why we need generative models for graphs, and I think Shia has done a really good job at helping me to do that. All the examples that she gave are about molecular graphs, but I'm going to be touching also on other applications that have similar challenges as the ones that she has mentioned. Then I'll talk a little bit about network science, which is like this field that has been looking at how to generate graphs that look like real according to some property for a long time, and what kind of lessons we have learned from network science. And then later on about the deep graph generative models. That's again what we have been we have heard about mostly so far today. So I'm going to give you an overview of different types of approaches that can be used to address these problems. Then I'll give you one example of a generative model for flow graphs, which is a problem that I have worked before. And then some of these recent advances in opportunities, I think a little bit like looking forward about this field. And finally, I will just conclude. Yeah, so why do we care about generating graphs? It's because graphs are a very ubiquitous data structure or framework for modeling complex systems from different applications. So you can think of maybe size graphs that are molecules, right, where you have atoms and bonds connecting them. You can also think about graphs representing people and how they interact in society. Think about knowledge graphs, right? You have different concepts and how they are related according to some semantics. You have things like infrastructure networks where you can model locations as nodes and then how we can move from one location to another as edges. So in this case, you have a road network. Communication, right? You can have people being represented as nodes and then or vertices and how they communicate or how long they communicate and when do they communicate as edges in this graph. And finally, you can think of the ways in which different regions of the brain connect with each other. They are co-activated during some cognitive process as a graph as well. So just to give you some examples which graphs can be applied, and that motivates why we want to be able to generate realistic graphs in many of these applications. So now some specific applications of generative models for graphs. I think so the first one is benchmarking. So what often happens is we have an algorithm or a model that we believe is very accurate in some data set, but we don't really have access to the real data set because either that data is private or it belongs to some company that has that associates some financial value to the data, so it does not share it with the broader community. And in that case, how can we validate an algorithm? For instance, let's say if you develop a model for predicting properties of proteins, but you don't have access to some proprietary data that might belong to some pharmaceutical company, how can you still claim that your algorithm or your model is effective in that setting? Well, one way you can do this is by generating synthetic data that looks a lot like real data, right? So you can maybe have access to the data sets from the pharmaceutical company, and then, but from that data set, you can generate synthetic data that looks similar to the real data, but doesn't reveal any proprietary information. And then that data can be used by the research community to validate methods. So this is the idea. This is one very interesting application of generative models for benchmarking. Second application is data augmentation. So real data sets have a lot of issues, right? For instance, they might be biased. Some populations might be underrepresented in them, or they might have missing values. And in this case, generative models really give us an opportunity to improve or augment this data by using these models that have been discussed so far, right? So instead of starting from zero and trying to generate, let's say, a graph, I might start from some graph that is partially observed or that has some bias and try to generate from that a graph that is more effective for some tasks. So again, maybe it's unbiased or maybe it doesn't have any missing data. So that's the second application, just how you can improve real data sets using generative models. The third application is drug discovery. So I won't talk much about this here because that was the topic of Shia's talk. Right, but I think I just wanted to mention this, that I thought was very interesting when I was doing some research on this, that if you look today, a lot of the drugs that get patented are just some small variations of drugs that already exist. And so there's this very interesting problem of which is called scaffold hopping, which basically how can you have a molecule that still has some properties, like for instance, reacts in some setting or reacts to some disease, but that looks different enough from an existing molecule so that you can patent it. I think this is a problem that, again, a lot of people are interested in, right? Has a lot of financial value. And you can do this using the techniques such as the ones that Shia described in the previous talk. And in that case, right, like you're generating a graph now, in this graph, you might have some condition, right, that you want to generate this graph such that it has the property that you want to obtain from the resulting. So the next application is code generation. So this is in a way very similar to the examples we have seen before, right? So writing code is a very complex task. It requires a lot of expertise. And one important question is whether we can sort of like reduce the need for human experts to write code, right? For instance, would I be able to write the specification of the code in natural language and then obtain an implementation? I guess that would help a lot of graduate students all over the country, right, to get their experiments done much faster. So you can also use generative models for that. And in that case, you can model the code as a graph. And then you can either specify what the code is supposed to do or give some examples of inputs and outputs for that code that you expect for the code. Or maybe you have a version of the code that's not functional yet. And in that case, you can train a model that will be able to generate the code. And there are different approaches for doing this. The one is just to think of code as just a natural language. So you try to use something like a transformer where you're going to predict token by token to generate the code. But that has some problems. For instance, the code that you might generate might violate the grammar of the language. So you might not even be able to run that code or to compile that code. Instead, a more interesting approach is actually to use what we call an abstract syntax tree that sort of captures the rules of the language, if you say, and then try to build from those trees, augment them so that you get the code that you desire to obtain. So there's an interesting paper from 2019 that proposed an approach based on what I just described to you. But again, this is just some applications of generative models. Of course, there are many more that I wouldn't be able to describe here, and they are all related to graphs. For instance, you can use graph generative models for efficient simulations of physical problems, for instance, weather, flooding, etc. In that case, the graph can capture some geometry of the location, like can be a mesh discretization, for instance, of some space. You can use also for protein design, which is not very different from molecular design. Also for material design. So how can you get a material? How can you generate a material that has certain properties? In the case, you can represent the materials as graphs. You can generate city maps, right? So I have a lot of examples of maps of different cities, and I want to generate a city that looks realistic. There's work on that. Also graph visualization, right? If you have a graph and you want to understand how this graph looks like, there's a lot of sort of uncertainty or randomization in different ways that you can visualize a graph. And you can use generative models to look for effective visualizations for graph data. And of course, we have a lot of other benefits that are similar to the benefits that we have for generative models for, I guess, non-graph data, which you can use these generative models for uncertain quantification, for anomaly detection, and etc. So graphs also inherit those same nice properties. So just to formalize what we're calling a generative model for a graph. So in this case, a graph is just a tuple. We're calling here G. It has a set of vertices, set of edges. And then for each of these, I can have attributes. So I can have node attributes or vertex attributes and edge attributes. So for instance, in the case of the molecular graph, maybe the node attribute can be the type of atom, and then the edge attribute can be the type of bond between the atoms. And in machine learning, we usually divide models into two groups. One is what we call discriminative model, which is models that we can use to predict something about the data. So in this case here, right, I'm trying to predict some property Y from the data set G. And then you have generative models, which allow us to sample from the data or to understand or to model the probability distribution over the data. So for instance, I might want to know something about the probability of all possible graphs that exist. I might want to know the joint probability between the graphs that exist and some labels that they might have, for instance, some property of the molecular graph. Or I might want to condition on the property and generate a graph that has that desired property. So this is something that you can do using generative models. Just to give you like a little bit of background on what this means. And when you're looking at generative models for graphs, there are a few challenges that sort of like makes it different from generative models for other types of data. One of them was also mentioned in Zia's talk, is these are invariances, right? For instance, graphs are rotation invariant, they are permutation invariant. So you want to make sure that when you apply some operation on the graph, the properties, some of the properties still remain true. That is a challenge in a lot of cases. Also, graphs are non-IID, meaning that each node in the graph is not independent from each other. There are correlations between these vertices, and then you have to model that, and sometimes that becomes a challenge. You can think of like a node in a graph as like a pixel in an image, and there's correlations between the pixel and the neighborhood of that pixel. There's problems with size. Some real graphs can have millions or billions of vertices. Mostly you have been focused on small graphs, but there are a lot of applications, maybe even more applications where we care about larger graphs, and those graphs are very hard to generate. There's the fact that graphs are discrete. So for instance, when you try to apply something like diffusion to graphs, you sort of like hit this problem where you need to generate a discrete data structure. So it's very hard to sample in this discrete space. That's a challenge. And finally, graphs are just combinatorial structures, right? So I can always come up with some property of a graph that I just cannot compute efficiently, right? For instance, if I might want to know something about the best traveling salesman route in that graph, right? That's an NP-hard problem. So in that case, how can I guarantee that the graphs that I'm generating are realistic if I might not even be able to compute efficiently the properties that I want to compute to evaluate them? Right, so mostly we evaluate these graphs using properties that we can compute in polynomial time, but actually a lot of interesting properties of graphs cannot be computed in that case. So we don't really know whether those graphs have those properties or not, at least for reasonably sized graphs. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about network science, try to address this problem of generating graphs. So network science is this field that it's a science for networks, right? So you think of networks as abstraction for complex systems, and it looks at what are the properties of these real systems and how can we both compute these properties and how you can generate data that has this property. So again, very related to generative models, right? It's about reproducing some relevant property. Just to make some examples of properties that people might be interested in. For instance, I might want to know something about the degree distribution of my graph, right? What's the probability that a node will have a degree X? That's the kind of property that I might want to reproduce using my generative model. I might care about the clustering coefficient of my graph. What's the probability that say a triad in my graph is closed, meaning that it's a complete graph. Again, a lot of graphs, we know that the clustering coefficient is non-trivial. How can I make sure that my graph, the generated graph has that property? Also properties about paths, right? A lot of interesting properties of graphs are related to how nodes can reach each other through edges in the graph. Things like what's the average shortest path, what's the diameter of the graph, are all properties that might be relevant. And so this is something that network science tries to look at, right? So if I give you a graph, if you give a graph to network scientists, they're going to compute these properties, and they, based on these properties, they kind of can visualize a graph even without drawing, just because these properties are so like comprehensive in a way. And we know a lot of things about how real graphs look like in terms of these properties. For instance, we know that real graphs have skewed degree distributions, they have high clustering coefficient, and the average shortest path or the diameter is usually smaller than one would expect. And then, based on these properties, what has been done is that a lot of generative models for graphs have been proposed for network science. And the simplest of them is what we call the Erdős-Rényi model. It's just like a random graph model, right? Given a number of nodes, I can give a probability of two nodes to be connected. And now I can basically run this process, and at the end, I'll have a graph. And then, of course, I'm interested in whether that graph looks realistic or not according to some metrics. And for random graphs, that's actually very convenient to compute these properties because it's mathematically tractable. So I can compute, for instance, a closed form for the degree distribution, which is approximately a Poisson distribution. I'll show an example later on. We can also compute, again, in closed form, what's the clustering coefficient of a Erdős-Rényi graph, and also the diameter. So again, very convenient, right? Remember, like from what we have talked before, the challenge of interpreting generative models. Well, here, it's very easily interpretable. I can manipulate properties of these graphs mathematically, which is like, very convenient. So this is an example of a graph. So here on the left, I'm showing you a real graph. So these are co-mentions of that politicians made when they were talking in the Congress, in the US Congress. So each politician here is a node, and there's an edge if they have mentioned each other during their speeches. And then on the right, I'm showing you what's the degree distribution of this graph. So given a degree value, what's the probability that a node has that degree? And this is a property that we are usually interested in when you're trying to generate a graph, right? Does the degree distribution follows what you would expect in the real world? And you can see here that, for instance, in the random graph, the degree distribution doesn't really fit the real data, right? So there's a mismatch here. And even if you look at the other properties, like the diameter, the clustering coefficient, especially clustering coefficient, it's really far from what one would expect. So this is a sign that this model, even though it's very simple, is very convenient, it doesn't really reproduce some of the properties that one might care about when they're generating syntactic data. There's an alternative model that's more powerful that try for generating graphs. This is it's called, in general, it's called preferential attachment. There are different versions of it. The most popular one is the Barabasi-Albert model. It's a more complicated model. It has more parameters, but it can generate graphs that have properties that are a little bit more similar to what one would expect in the real world. So, and one of the key properties here is, again, the degree distribution. We know that for Barabasi-Albert's graph, the degree distribution looks like a power law, which is something that we have observed in, again, real-world graphs. So just an example, again, the same graph. I'm showing you here the topology on the left, and then on the right, I'm showing you what's the degree distribution. Right, so given the degree, what's the probability that a node has that degree? And you can see here that for Barabasi-Albert's graphs, the fit of the distribution is much better, right? So in this case, this particular model is able to generate graphs that look real. And you can think that this type of analysis also applies to modern models, right? Where I get some graph that's being generated by a neural network, and I want to say whether that graph has the properties that I might care about, including, say, the degree distribution or the clustering coefficient. So now let's talk a little bit about deep generative graph models. Right, so these are models that they became popular much later than the network science models, and they are models based on neural networks, right? So some examples are adversarial neural networks, variation autoencoders, and etc. So what do they do, right? You have to give them a database of graphs, let's say graphs from G1 to Gn, and my goal is to learn some distribution P or some model P that allows me to sample from this graph, right? So basically to sample from the distribution. So now, for instance, if I want to just sample a graph from the distribution, I can do that, or I can sample conditionally on some property. For instance, what is the property that I desire for the molecule that I'm trying to generate? And there are multiple approaches for generating graph data like this using this kind of models, but they can be divided into two types. One is what we call a sequential model, and the other one is what we call one-shot model. These areas really started around 2018. That was the first paper, like using modern deep learning to try to generate graph data. And now, I mean, there are multiple surveys on this topic, so I just have some reference here if you're interested to learn more about this. So just to distinguish this is a very important distinction between these two types of model. They are very convenient in different settings. For instance, sequential models, what you do is that you try to generate substructures one at a time. So in simplest case, you might want to generate nodes one at a time. So you think of nodes like being generated sequentially, and you just condition the generation of the new node based on the nodes that you have generated so far, or based on the graph you have generated so far. It's a very simple model, but it has some drawbacks. For instance, it's very computationally expensive because of the number of edges that this graph might have with quadratic. Another like more effective way to generate a graph is that instead of generating node by node, you can generate edge by edge. These are edge sequential graphs, and this has been shown to be more effective in a lot of applications. But on the other hand, like the challenge of generating graph data, sort of like based on nodes or edges, is that you might generate, for instance, and this was mentioned in the previous talk as well, data that doesn't make sense, right? That violates some physical property, some chemical property that you know. One way to try to avoid this is by using some substructures that you know exist in the real world and they are consistent with properties that you would expect. For instance, you can use motifs. So this has been done, for instance, in the case of chemistry, where you can have these chemical substructures that are well known, and you can think of them as building blocks for learning more complex molecules. This has been shown to be more effective. It's also more efficient because the generating process is much faster because you don't have to worry about sort of like the very low granularity parts of the generation. However, even if you have a generated model that works with motifs, you still run to the risk of generating a final data set or a final graph that violates some important property. Especially when you think about like very global properties that might be a function of the entire graph of a large fraction of the graph. In that case, it's often more convenient to try to generate the entire graph all at once. That's the only way we know to make sure that these global properties are guaranteed. However, of course, generating an entire graph at once might be very hard. You might run into memory issues if your graph is large, or even computational issues like running time. One way to try to avoid this is to generate lists of edges, and this has been shown to be more effective, but still this challenge of generating an entire graph at once still exists, and we don't really have a very solution for this. So just to give you some perspective, right? We talked about these network science models and then deep generative models, and they have both advantages and disadvantages, right? So for instance, some of the advantages of the deep models is that, well, they are very accurate, as we have seen several results. They are also very flexible, so I don't really have to define a mathematical model for my data set. I can just give some database, and then the model can learn directly from the data. They can handle much richer data than classical models. They can handle attributes, node attributes, edge attributes, and so on. But there are some disadvantages, right? One of them is clearly that these deep models are not interpretable. We don't really know exactly what the model is generating or what it might generate. We can only explore the model by querying it and generating samples, but that's very ineffective, right? And the other thing is that like learning this model is very inefficient, right? It requires a lot of computational resources, GPUs, and etc. that might not be accessible to the broader community. So now let me give you an example of a generative model for graphs that we have developed in the past. And this model is for a type of graph that we call the flow graph. So a flow graph is a type of graph that shows up in a lot of applications. It's a graph where you have sort of like physical quantities that move through the edges of the graph. So you can think of it like as a road network where you have cars that move over the edges of the road network, or a power network where you have power moving through the wires, communication where you might have like bits or information being transferred, or even water where this quantity is just water being transmitted through, for instance, across the city. So these are all networks that have this physical quantity that's being distributed through the structure of the network. And there's usually a physical law that governs how this structure is distributed. For instance, like classical type of law is conservation, right? We know that, for instance, power and water are conserved. So if you see a flow graph, you'd expect that, for instance, the amount of water coming in a pipe will be very similar to the amount of water coming out, except if there's a leak or if there's nothing else. But these sort of like conservation properties or the physical properties are very relevant in this kind of graph. So it's important to be able to capture them. I'll just give you an example here. So this is a data set from it's a mobility data set from New York City. So each node here is basically a cab station. So, and people can take cabs and move around the city. And what I'm showing you here on the nodes is basically the color is whether that node is a sink or a source. So your source, if you so here green nodes are sources, means that more people go out of those nodes than they come in. And red is the opposite. These are sinks, so more people are coming in than going out. So you can think of these as results of daily patterns, like people going to work or coming back home. So I'm showing you here what happens in the morning in New York City and then what happens at night. Again, very different patterns related to how people use this transportation infrastructure. And I would like to be able to generate graphs like this, right? So these are flow graphs. There is some quantity. In this case, are people that are being moved through the graph. These graphs have some interesting properties, and I might want, for instance, to validate some algorithm, and for that I will need some real data or some synthetic data that looks like real. So what is the challenge? Most of the models that have been discussed so far, even in both the talks today, they assume that the graph is undirected, which is not true for flow graphs. There's direction. So how can you model that? And also, there's a very important coupling between flows and the graph topology. And this gives some of the global properties that are hard to capture, as I described before. For instance, you have things like flow conservation, cyclic patterns, hotspots, and things like that. So these are all properties that you can't really capture by looking at a single node. You have to look at a larger portion of the graph, and that becomes a problem for generative models. So let me just give you a quick overview of how you solve this problem. So this is a generative model, and it's a one-shot model based on what I described before. So that means that it generates the entire graph at once. And in this case, our graph is just a flow matrix. It has, for each edge, the amount of flow that's going to the edge. And this model is very simple, actually. It's just a neural network that outputs the flows. What's interesting here is, well, how can you make sure that this data looks like real, right? So here we apply what we call an adversarial model or generative adversarial network, or GAN, which is a type of generative model. And the idea of this model is that there are two players, right? So it's a game theoretical setting where a player is what we call a generator and the other one is a discriminator. So what the generator does is that it generates a graph, and we expect that this graph will look like real. What the discriminator does is try to predict whether that graph is a real graph or a fake graph or synthetic graph. And you can see here that most of the complexity actually lies on the discriminator, right? How can the discriminator look at a graph and predict whether that graph is real or not? Especially, again, if you're trying to capture global properties of graphs that depends on a lot of vertices, that requires a lot of sophistication. In this case, what we propose is a graph neural network that both captures directions and generates at the end a single representation for the entire graph. And from that representation, we try to predict whether the graph is real or not, and we have shown that this actually is effective. So I won't give a lot of details about this model, but there's a lot of novelties here, like in capturing directions, trying to capture some of these global properties of flows and etc. I'm just going to show you some results. So here, again, similar to some results we have seen before, what I'm showing you is I'm comparing some statistics of the real data set with the statistics of the graphs that I generate. And most of these metrics are sort of distances, so I want them to be small. And you can see that for a lot of them, our model kind of provides the lowest distance. To give an example, like we can compare the in-degree distribution of the real data set with the ones of the graph that you generate. In this case, we show that the distance between the data that we generate and the real data is much smaller than several of the existing baselines. And again, this is because these models are not very effective at capturing the kind of global property that I mentioned before. And this is true for 4 different data sets. So you have here the CAB data set, and you have also the power data set. And here, just to show you some examples of how this data looks like. So I'm showing you here some samples from the real data set. So again, some red nodes here are sources, and the green nodes are sinks. And for different times, there's a change between who is a source and who is a sink. And then these are samples generated by our model, and they capture like a lot of what we expect based on the real data set, right? So you have this sort of like interesting structure where there's some hotspot, depending on the time of the day, for both of the morning and night. And then we have the best baseline here, and we see that the graph generator doesn't really reproduce the properties that we want. Just to illustrate so let me try to wrap up my presentation now. So first, let's talk about some, right, given the challenge that I have described, right? I just want to discuss very briefly some of these recent advances in generative models that can be used for graphs or have been used for graphs, and how, like, what opportunities we have in using these developments to solve new problems or solve harder problems. So some of these developments are graph transformers, which have been described here. So transformers are this like very powerful model that is behind ChatGPT and most models for NLP right now. And they have this very nice property, right? You have this multi-head attention, positional encoding, you can process things in parallel. But doing transformers in graphs is very hard, because now what we would like to have is that instead of just looking at properties at the edge level, we would like to capture some long range properties in the graph, right? So if you look at, you'd like to capture, let's say, paths that might be reasonably long in the graph, and those nodes will be related to some property, right? How can we do that? Well, if you want to do that in the trivial way, you need some n-square space or running time, and that's infeasible for even small graphs. In that case, one interesting advance happened recently is the development of what we call sparse graph transformers that can really reduce this n-square number of interactions. I'm almost done, Jim. So again, other examples are graph diffusion. These are diffusion models for graphs, and how we can kind of interact diffusion or foundational models for language and also graph for multimodal data. I'm going to skip this and just show one example of like an opportunity for using generative models in another application, which is fair machine learning. So let me just go directly here. So this, typically when you have a machine learning data set, in this case, a graph data set, you have missing data. So here I'm showing you that, so this is like, you can think of it as a credit score application, people of different genders, and then I'm assuming the genders are binary, and some of this gender information is missing. How can I run a model that's fair, given that this data might be missing, right? Given that the only way I can assess fairness is based on these protected attributes, well, I have to do some type of data imputation. And what we have shown, again, I'm just going to show one slide, is that you can actually use generative model to impute the data in a way that makes the model fairer. So you can use this to basically generate data that guarantees that the predictions of the model are fair according to some criteria. Again, I won't give a lot of details. And I'll just wrap up. And again, I guess the take-home message from this talk is that, well, graphs can really benefit from some of these advances in generative models that we have seen recently. But at the same time, graphs have particular challenges that are, in that case, some of these advances might not directly translate to the graph case. So there's some additional work that has to be done. And yeah, so thanks for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Arlei, for a wonderful talk, showing a lot of the possibilities and exciting applications. I want to start by making sure that one question that was asked to Xia get answered, and that's the question Dennis Akirov asked. Xia, I think you put down some answers in chat.
Yes.
Would you like to repeat the question and give a brief answer?
Yes, I think the question was how we represent the surface of the molecules and how the conformations are generated. So to represent the surface of molecules, actually we first generate the mass over 3D surfaces. So that's a very typical technique from computer vision or computer graphics. And from the mesh, we do the sampling, just sample some points along, on the map that give us the 3D point cloud. It's a rough representation or rough approximation of the surface structures or surface shapes. And for the conformation, we use the conformations or 3D structures generated from RDK, but our method is, I mean, we don't really require, quote unquote, require the correct conformation. Our method is able to generate similar structures to any given structures. So that's why, I mean, if you have a known conformation to a particular target, you just input that to our model and we can generate similar structures. So in terms of training, we don't really require quote unquote the correct conformation to the protein targets. So I think
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I also see that Gil Oman raised his hand. I wonder whether we can unmute Gil. Let's see.
Gil, if you're there, you should be able to unmute.
Actually, I was really just wanted to compliment the program. I wasn't intending to actually be called on and ask questions. I am very interested about the graphs, though, and I think there's a lot of nice work on graphing methods here by my colleague Indika Rajapakse here in computational medicine and bioinformatics. Might be interested. It's interesting to a lot of other people. Let it go with
Thank
that.
you. Yeah, thank you, Gil. And I think I saw another raised hand, but I think she might have, yeah, no, okay. So so the question in Q&A is, are there examples of where graphs can be generated to map communication flows of IT infrastructure networks?
Yes.
Do either of you, yeah, Arlei.
Yeah, so we have looked at like flow data sets. We haven't looked specifically about like communication, like computer networks, but I think it is an example where you see some of the challenges that I have mentioned here. I guess in that case, if you assume you already have the flows, then how can you find the network that has those flows? Might be a slightly trickier problem. But now if you have samples of communication networks, and if you just want to sample from that communication, for instance, to try your routing algorithm, you should be able to easily do it using some of the techniques that I described in my talk. That answers the question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so for audience members who have more questions, feel free to put them in Q&A. Meanwhile, I'm going to go back to some of the questions that people asked during the registration process. Some of the questions actually were already covered in your talks, but there are additional ones. Here, I want to start with this one. Do you have any advice about combining lab results, simulation modeling, and machine learning? Xia, and then Arlei.
Probably I will answer this question first. So first off, I feel it's very important to incorporate or in general, human in the loop or simulation or lab results in the loop. And I think we need some systematic ways to do that. One very probably straightforward ways to, I mean, within the framework of reinforcement learning, we use either simulation or human expertise or results produced from the wet lab as quote unquote our reward. And it's like that's a way to incorporate expertise, I mean, domain knowledge within the system. But overall, I agree, I would say that's probably what we really need to do if we want to make trustworthy results and also the results that are quote unquote more realistic. And I also feel like systematical research and systematical ways are really needed in order to do that. Probably that's my short answer. So Arlei?
Just a quick comment. I think that's a very interesting question. So again, the way that I see, like when you run an experiment, right, it's like you have this kind of like big, if you think about graphs, you have this big space, right, of like possible points that you can sample. And then if you can sample only a few of them, you can only say a little bit about what is happening with the entire distribution, right? So you'd expect the distribution to be like smooth, so that with a few samples, you can estimate like which are the modes and etc. But if it's a very kind of like noisy distribution, you might need too many samples, meaning like too many experiments to actually understand what's happening. So I think we probably should first, I mean, I guess part of the problem is actually understanding whether these models actually are smooth models, in the sense that when you look at few samples of what's happening, let's say in the lab, that actually says a lot about what's happening in the model or not. I think that's a challenge, I think, that has to be addressed as well.
Next question. Let's go to Q&A. Look at the question there. This is for Arlei. Can you comment on the latest development of graph neural operators for solving partial differential equations?
So I mean, yeah, there's a lot of excitement around like Fourier neural operators. I mean, like including in weather prediction, and like I'm particularly interested in how they can be applicable to flood prediction. It's one of the problems that I'm really interested in. And again, the hope is that these models can help us to capture like physical properties, like physical laws from the models. Again, there are some exciting results on weather forecasting, showing that you can actually efficiently predict, for instance, the route of a hurricane during a storm. We haven't seen a lot of similar results in other applications, and there is some kind of like concerns about like how accurate these models are in applications where accuracy is a big concern. When you have to simulate things at a very low resolution, there are some negative results. So yeah, I think it's again, it's very exciting. There are some alternative models, including based on graphs, that also for weather forecasting. There's a recent model that claims to be the state of the art. That's a graph-based model. But yeah, but again, neural operators are quite exciting area, and I think there's a lot of, but there are some questions on whether they are the right approach to addressing these problems.
Next question from the pre-registered the pre-registration is can you comment on the application of generative AI to support predictive toxicology and ecotoxicology of chemical exposures?
So Jing, when you say generative AI in this case, does it indicate ChatGPT or?
Not specified. So just, yeah.
So I think if we are talking about ChatGPT, I think definitely that's possible. So you can ask ChatGPT about, I mean, all the toxicity. I mean, give you some, for example, explanation about toxicity of small molecules, or when it happens, I mean, when it's going to be toxic, that type of questions. But my concern is, if we talk about ChatGPT is not very accurate for some very domain-specific topics. For example, in our case, if we ask ChatGPT why a reaction happens, it doesn't give us very, to some extent, even not accurate question. So I would have some concerns if we talk about ChatGPT in terms of answering these questions. If we talk about generative AI to generate small molecules or generate products that are not toxic, and then definitely I would say there are possibilities, for example, generate small molecules or polymers or other materials which have low toxicity. Technically, we can do that. I mean, I see the promising from there. I mean, probably depends on what you mean by generative AI here.
Just a quick comment. I feel like toxicity is like more a property of the molecule, so it seems like it's a discriminative model instead of generative one. I guess the generative version of this problem is like you tell the toxicity, and then you can get a molecule that has that property, right? But if you're just trying to predict something about the molecule, then you could, in principle, use a discriminative model that's much more efficient to be trained.
Okay, so the next few questions, I'm combining them into one. But the next few questions I can, so these are also from the, let's see. Okay, yeah, these are also submitted on the webinar registration form. So I'm trying to interpret their questions, but I think these are more sort of the ChatGPT type of models that the questions are referring to, which are how do you, for those kind of models, how do you design formal verification of the results and showing sort of the work process of the model, and also grounding the results in reality?
That's a tough question. I'm not sure if I have the answer for that for if we are talking about ChatGPT, but if we're talking about all the generative models that I have been presenting, I think that's a very important thing, as I just mentioned. It's about trustworthiness and whether I mean, also the evaluation and the validation. I feel probably that's the next big step that, I mean, at least in my lab or in the research community, that we need to consider. And how to do that, I mean, it's not still clear to me. I mean, even in our research, I mean, how to explain or how to validate, like, this is why we should add atom here, or why this reaction happens, or why this molecule should be modified in this case. I mean, I think, I mean, I personally, I don't have a good idea about how to do that, but definitely, as I mentioned in my presentation, that's a very important next step. Probably this is what I can offer at this point.
Arlei, do you have anything to add here?
I think most of the models, I agree, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I think most of the models we discuss here are you're just feeding some function, right? That sort of like you can use that function to sample some data. There's really no like sort of fundamental model that's being, right, like so physical model, chemical model that you can, so that you can guarantee some properties that you would need to have formal verification, right? I think there's a simpler question, which is a challenge, is even about cause and effect, right? Like you have a molecule and then you have this component, and you know that this component is the cause of this property, right? Can we even measure that? I mean, that already seems challenging enough. Like and there are some cases where you can do that. You can do some perturbation on the molecule and see what's the effect on the predictor, but it's really hard to guarantee something about, again, a vast space of molecules that you could generate with these models. I think that's a big challenge, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you both. We're right on time. So this is great. Thank you both for the fascinating work, and also for sharing that with the audience. And I hope the audience members will be able to use these kind of examples to think harder about their research and the use of the new AI methods. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you guys next week for the next 2 installments.
Thanks for the invitation.
For having me.